About a third of people with diabetes are at risk of having these complications like diabetic retinopathy or diabetic nephropathy. But at the time when they're diagnosed with diabetes, it's impossible, has been impossible to identify who's going to go on the pathway, so everybody's treated the same way. Now we have the ability to identify people at the time of diagnosis who are at highest risk of going on to develop diabetes complications. I'm Grant Morahan, Professor of Diabetes Research at the University of Western Australia, also Honorary Professor at the University of Melbourne Medical School. First of all, I had a great opportunity to do my PhD at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in Melbourne, then followed that up with a postdoc at Scripps Clinic in California. I came back to Weehai in Melbourne to head up a laboratory looking at immune tolerance. So what happens to the immune system? How is the immune system regulated so that T cells don't attack the body? Because when they do, that results in autoimmune diseases. So we had great success in various mouse models of immune tolerance, but I'd always thought that this was still away from helping people in the clinic. So I pivoted from immunological studies towards genetics, and we researched the genetics of a mouse model of type 1 diabetes. And in that work, we were pretty successful in identifying genes, mapping genes. This was in the early 90s, and part of the problem we had in those days was that it was difficult to get funding because the referees said there's no evidence that type 1 diabetes has a genetic basis. Well, since that time, we've found over 40 genes in humans. So a big pivot was for me to switch also from the mouse studies to human studies. We were the first in the world to look at the genetics of type 1 diabetes in humans. And we made several big discoveries there, showing new ways to analyse genetic data in humans so that we could find these genes. This was successful, and I was invited by the National Institutes of Health to serve on the steering committee of an international type 1 diabetes genetics consortium. This did the largest ever human study. It was based in families. We recruited over 4,000 families all throughout the world. I led the recruitment in the Asia Pacific region, and from that work we were able to identify over 40 genes that affected type 1 diabetes risk. So the thing about type 1 diabetes is that it's a complex genetic disease, as are most of the diseases that affect people, things like cancer, heart disease, dementias and so on. And like many other complex genetic diseases, the genes that we did identify each have a very small impact on disease risk. So what we've been able to do more recently and over the last 10 years is find new ways of analysing these data so that we can find genes that have, or genetic interactions that have bigger risk. And now we've been able to develop diagnostic tests just based upon simple genetic variants that can predict a person's risk of all sorts of diseases, from diabetes complications through to dementia. Well, for type 1 diabetes, all the research that I've been doing is genetic basis. So we started off by looking at SIB pair studies. So the idea is that if we're looking at two people within the same family who have the same disease, they should share the same disease genes. And so this is the basis of the type 1 diabetes genetics consortium work, to study over 4,000 families which had siblings both with type 1 diabetes. So that was the work that we found, over 40 risk genes that affected type 1 diabetes. More recently, we've been looking at diabetes complications, and we've come up with a test that can diagnose people's risk of getting diabetes complications. The problem with diabetes complications is that about a third of people with diabetes are at risk of having these complications like diabetic retinopathy or diabetic nephropathy. But at the time when they're diagnosed with diabetes, it's impossible, has been impossible to identify who's going to go on the pathway. So everybody's treated the same way. Now we have the ability to identify people at the time of diagnosis who are at highest risk of going on to develop diabetes complications. So I was recruited to Western Australia to be the inaugural chair of diabetes research at the University of Western Australia, and that was a big initiative of Diabetes Research WA. They were then called Diabetes Research Foundation. So they've been the major organisation I've been working with over the last 20 years. Other organisations I've been working with include, as I said, National Institutes of Health in the US to work on the Type 1 Diabetes Genetics Consortium. We've been having funding from MTP Connect to do these diabetes risk tests, the complex genetic disease risk tests, and also the Australian Centre for Accelerating Diabetes Innovations. And we've been working with them to develop a test for diabetes complications and move that forward to the clinic. MTP Connect has provided funding, and there's been funding from ACADI, Australian Centre for Accelerating Diabetes Innovations. Diabetes Research WA provided the initial funding to bring me to Western Australia. I think the greatest thing about research is being able to discover things. Every single day you have the potential to find something new, something that no one has ever found before. And moreover, it's the ability to do things that can actually help people, to make a difference in people's lives. In medical research in particular, we have the ability to make discoveries that can be for the benefit of people right around the world. So that provides me with a big motivation. Well, outside of my day job, which is, as I described it, the human genetics, we also have a big effort in looking at the genetics of complex traits in mouse models. And this has been another project that I've been able to collaborate with researchers around Australia and around the world. And we've been able to make really incredible discoveries with this. This is the most powerful resource in the world for gene discovery. And just in the last week, our colleagues in 2 different countries have come up with a cure for cancer and also a cure for ageing. Of course, this work is not yet published, but it has great potential. And watch this space.